Get ready when you are, Lars.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this IDS member seminar. So this is the first IDS member seminar for this term, and today I'm delighted to introduce Terry Cannon, who will be familiar to the IDS community from being a fellow at IDS for many years, and also contributing to teaching in the Climate Change Development and Policy course, as well as the MA Dev course. And he will also be familiar for his contributions to disaster risk reduction literature, as well as adaptation over 40 years and more. And he's made significant contributions along a range of different issues. And today he will talk about neoliberalism. And this is part one of a two-part lecture collection. So I'll leave it to him to introduce the topic, and he will speak for about 45 minutes, after which there will be opportunities to ask questions and Q&A until about 2:30. So welcome, Terry, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lars. Very nice to be here with you. I should start by saying that neoliberalism isn't my research area. Lars has hinted that that relates to climate change adaptation and disasters and rural livelihoods. But what I've found in recent years is that many of the students at IDS are puzzled about what is neoliberalism and do not seem to get very much on it in any of your master's courses. And so I think this is such an important topic and very important for you at the start of the degree process that you understand it. So this is not going to help you get jobs, but it might help you to understand the world. And that's my goal, is how do we make sense of the world and the inequality and the poverty which literally surrounds us? How many of you from overseas were shocked to see how many homeless people are living on the streets in Brighton? Yeah, most of you, I imagine. And how many of you know that around 1 million households have to resort to food banks in Britain every week? Yeah, I mean, this is just quite an extraordinary situation. And so what I'm going to be talking about is how do we get here? What has led to this particular version of capitalism to arrive? Now, one of the things I would like to do, because the second part of this is such an enormous topic, I'm doing the second part on the 29th of October, also here in this seminar format. What I would like to do is to explore the idea that we might put together a website or a collection of blogs on how neoliberalism has affected your country. And we would put those together because there is not much going on about how neoliberalism has worked itself out in terms of the so-called global south and what it has meant for people, poverty, inequality, and power relationships there. So at the end, at 2:30, if any of you have still got any energy, you're very welcome to stay, and we'll see if we can map out some kind of plan for how we might achieve that. Now, if you can't stay, simply give me your name and email, and we can put something together. And then there's the second chance on October the 29th. So think about that as we go through this. Okay. So, beginning. So there's my email if you need to write to me, or you just, it'll come up on the website anyway. Very complicated to talk about neoliberalism, even in the 2 slots I've got. it's going to be difficult to cover it all. If I say something that you don't understand, do interrupt me, because it will be better to clarify it right there. Obviously not for discussion points, but if I say something that you need me to define or explain immediately, then please stop me, and I'm very happy to do that. Otherwise, discussion points come at the end. So, the beginning. What is neoliberalism? And the first thing I want to say is it is not the same as capitalism. It's a flavor, it's a version of capitalism. And I think it's really important that we understand that it is not the same as capitalism. It's one of the many different types of capitalism. It's also not the same as globalization. Globalization has existed for thousands of years. You can find traded products all over the world of things that have been taken. There's been migration, there has been transport, there's been trade. Humans are globalized and have almost always been globalized. So we can't equate neoliberalism either with capitalism or with neoliberalism. So it's really quite important that we understand these conceptual things. Basically, one of the key things about neoliberalism is that it is a faith in the market. A faith in the market and opposition to the role of the state. Now, I use the word faith carefully because it implies religion. And what you will see is that as we unpack what is neoliberalism, you find that there are aspects of it which are almost dealt with as a religious fervor. And the people who believe in it carry on believing in it against the evidence, just as with religion. You can perfectly believe in something without evidence if you have faith. So it'll be really important to understand this. Some people describe it as market fundamentalism. The idea that, again, fundamentalism implies a kind of religious or a political adherence to something beyond the evidence. Anyone got any thoughts about which key things that we at IDS are interested in solving, which can never, ever be solved by markets?
Inequities, poverty.
Poverty, yeah, but more generally, not more generally, more specifically, sectors I'm thinking of, because the inequality means that people cannot afford to buy these things. What I'm interested in is, what is it they cannot afford to buy because if it's in a market? Healthcare. Is healthcare ever going to be solved anywhere in the world through a market? Education, hunger, water supply. Well, that's too. I'm thinking about actual things that people need to survive: health, education, water, food. None of those can be solved by markets. Humans have to organize our societies in different ways to solve those problems. And those who claim that you can deal with them through markets are lying, basically. They're applying their faith to it, either because they really do believe it, or because they can make money by marketizing something like healthcare. Okay. So I want to start off with some examples of neoliberalism in action, things that some of you might recognize. I would then go on to look at why is the terminology so confusing, which it really is confusing. Where does it come from? How did the terminology arise? Neoliberal, liberalism, freedom, and so on. And also some of that coming back to Adam Smith and misunderstanding Adam Smith. And I'll unpack that by looking at the last 200 years. What has happened politically and economically in the last 200 years in order that we've gone from original laissez-faire capitalism through welfare capitalism up to neoliberalism in the last 40 years or so. So this transition is what we need to unpack. And then why did these changes to the capitalist system happen? Why have there been transitions between different types of capitalism? And this involves looking at class and gender struggles, how people against the system have reacted, revolted, had indeed revolutions, fought for rights and work standards, slave rebellions and anti-slavery movements, and also independence movements in the colonies, which fought for and had supporters, sorry, it fought for independence and had supporters in Britain. And countries which were carrying out those colonies, there was opposition to them in Britain. Those of you taking notes, the slides will be available, so you don't need to take detailed notes. They'll be shared, and also a recording of this is going to be available. For those who want to come to the second one, they'll be able to look at this one before they come to the second one, which is on the 29th of October. Okay, defining neoliberalism. I like this one. Unfortunately, his website's gone down, but just take a minute to read that. And what's interesting is that he has also used words which relate almost to religion or ethics, that it is about a belief. And I think this fundamentalism is crucial to understanding what is going on. So some examples of how markets are created, invented, and think about who is benefiting from the creation of markets in products. There are winners and losers. One of the most crucial things that happens is the seizure of common property assets and resources, forests, fisheries, pastures, which are then converted into cash-based, privately owned assets. And this goes on all over the world. It was a key to the transition in Britain to capitalism and industrialization. All around us here in Britain, in the countryside, there is land which used to belong, was not owned by anyone, it was common land, which was seized by landowners to become privatized. This was the movement of enclosures, which went over a period of 200 years, in which the elite group seized land which was used by ordinary people for their own benefit and taken into private hands. Land rights, privatization, forced purchase, land grabbing, which you've probably all heard of, as a way in which people's original ownership of land can be taken by the powerful, where in the global south, the governments and foreign countries are involved. Kenya selling off land to countries in the Middle East, and so on. Transferring public services into private ownership. So this has been a key factor of neoliberalism, is the privatization of those public services, including water. There have been water battles in Bolivia, for example, where private companies were opposed for trying to take private profit out of the water market. Then we have the so-called sharing economy. The air in Airbnb, does anyone know this? The air stands for a bed which you pump up with air. Okay, the original idea was that you would have a room or your lounge, and you would pump up a mattress, you know, one of those inflatable mattresses, and earn a bit of money from letting people come and stay in your house. The so-called sharing economy. Well, we know where that has gone. So it has brought billions and billions to the owners of that company, very similar with Uber and these so-called ride-sharing economies. And then we have social media, in which we are the product, because our details are sold to companies that want lists of people that they can then market the products to, and also manipulate people's voting patterns. Climate change. This I'll cover much more in the second lecture, but it's about how reduction in greenhouse gases can supposedly be achieved through market mechanisms. And my argument would be that the ability to control emissions for climate change has been set back 30 years or more because of the insistence by the rich and the powerful that the market mechanism was the one which is going to be used for dealing with carbon emissions through trading, cap and trade, and so on. And the loss of biodiversity. The list is enormous. In biodiversity, you have the extraordinary idea that you can protect some biodiversity by ruining the land there, and then you buy another bit of land somewhere else, which is the equivalent. Well, it's not even the equivalent in terms of biodiversity, but you're not damaging the other biodiversity which you buy in order to damage what the company wants to do in a particular location. And the disruption of traditional markets, capturing traditional markets in order that corporations or private individuals have those controls. Now you can see that all of this big list is very visible to what's going on in the last 30 years or so, and has been enabled by the idea of markets being the predominant way in which humans should relate to each other, rather than collaboration and solidarity, as you were saying. This is the way humans should organize their existence is by exchanging money, not by collaboration or cooperation. This was a World Bank staff member 10 years ago who said this in a tweet. Now, if people like that are working for the World Bank, is it any wonder that the World Bank is rubbish? So key factors in neoliberal capitalism. First is the reduction of regulation in relating especially to safety issues, inspections, making sure that environment is not damaged, or trying to reduce environmental damage. And this is sometimes talked about as the bonfire of the red tape. Any of you heard that phrase? So this is the idea that you burn the red tape, not the lanyards around your neck. I'm excluding those. So red tape, you all know what we mean by red tape? Yes? Did anyone know where it came from? No? No, red tape was used in British offices to bind up the files. And so the red tape indicates government interference. It means that something should be done before you can achieve something which is supposed to make sure it's safe or acceptable. So the Tory party has been especially pronounced, and in America, the Republicans, about getting rid of red tape so that you can have more economic growth. And they sell that on the basis if we have economic growth, there'll be more employment. We are all affected by neoliberalism every single day of our lives. The neoliberal university, you are in a neoliberal university. What do I mean by that? In Britain, universities are now corporations. They're not for-profit corporations. There are no shareholders, which is quite interesting. It's completely unclear who owns them. They just exist. And they have a vice chancellor. The average salary for a vice chancellor in a university is around £450,000 a year, nearly £500,000 a year. Okay, and they want to profit, income maximize, and they do that by getting students. Now, this is rather different from IDS. Is it very different? But the universities, their principal source of income is student fees. Now, you know that the British student fees are around £9,000 a year. Postgraduate degrees are more, and you, if you're from a foreign country, are paying an enormous amount for your fees. And universities manipulate how many foreign students they get so that they can maximize that income. Okay. At the LSE, I haven't got the current figure, but some years ago, at the LSE, the proportion of foreign students was, when I last looked at the figure about 10 years ago, over 90%. Okay, I also teach at UCL in London, where I don't know the actual proportion of overseas students, but I know that 20% of the undergraduates, 20% are from China. This is the world that has been created by neoliberalism. Universities are no longer in Britain for the creation and protection of knowledge. Departments are closed down, humanities departments, language departments, cultural studies departments, archaeology departments, anything that is not regarded as attracting people who will pay fees is reduced or closed down because the university survives by income from fees. Very little central government funding. There is some for science subjects and technology subjects. So they're cost cutting. How do they cut costs? Half of the undergraduate teaching in British universities, 50%, and it's similar in the United States, is done by people who do not have proper lecturing jobs. These are teaching assistants, PhD students, others who are brought in. They get paid not very much, and they never know if they're going to work next year. They have a contract, let's say from September to July. They don't know if they will get another contract the next year. It's casual labor. It's like Deliveroo, but at a university. Okay, and this is a consequence of the idea in neoliberalism that a university has to exist on its own. It does not receive very much state funding, and it then just floats in the economy. Well, there's a lot more we could say about that. Oh, one thing, 3 years ago, the University of Sussex reduced the length of the terms from 11 weeks to 10 weeks and put the fees up. So people got 3 weeks less teaching, but paid more money for it. Oh, outsourcing. We're going to come to outsourcing. You all know what we mean by outsourcing? Yes, so catering, cleaning services, security services, and so on. I've already mentioned that. So another example, classic example of how neoliberalism enabled the reduction of regulation and safety was the crashes of this plane, which you will probably remember. In the construction industry, the control on building safety and construction quality is ruined in Britain. And you'll get one example of that in this. There is a cozy relationship between the private sector, who provide the inspections of buildings, and the building companies who are doing the construction. It's almost worthless now. And I'll be talking a little bit about the Grenfell Tower disaster. And then railway corporations. You've probably all experienced something of this in terms of the way it's disorganized or not quite clear, or the water supply. So these are all current examples which are affecting us in our everyday life. When the Sussex University decided to outsource its cleaning and catering, students protested, and they occupied the main administration building. And there were protests that went on. They lost in that struggle, but there was a big struggle because this was shifting people out of salaried jobs who knew the job, who believed in the work they did, kicking them out and bringing in a private company to make private profit out of giving people worse working conditions. And that is what happens with outsourcing. And it went ahead. Now, somehow or other, I'm not quite sure how it happened, but somebody in Kenya saw an earlier video of my talk and contacted me because the Sussex students, some of them were kicked out for leading the protests. And he wrote to me, sorry, this is the one. Galagito wrote to me and said, that's what happened to me in Kenya when the IMF told the Kenyan government to stop free education for students. And he was just short of his medical degree, and he was kicked out for protesting about that. In the next talk, I will be talking about structural adjustment programs. How many of you know about those? Okay, and what they happened was they were the principal method by which the Western capitalist economies imposed neoliberalism on the global South. So I'll talk about that in the next time. But he was kicked out. He was near the end of his studies to be a doctor, his career and his life ruined. And he was really interested in the fact that I was talking about this here. This is the Grenfell Tower, 2017. Any of you heard of it? Okay, so what happened here is that a block of flats, which was social housing, which was administered by a local government, the borough of Kensington, they put outside cladding, what's called cladding, on the outside. So this material here was put on to improve insulation, but the stuff they used burns like petrol. And what happened is that in a flat, I can't remember which floor it was on, a fridge caught fire. And that fire then spread outwards through the outside wall, and within a very short space of time, the entire block was in flames. 72 people died. And this tragedy has been the subject of an inquiry which came out 2 months ago, which I'll talk. So my friend at UCL said this about it. So this is what can happen if you reduce regulation, if you burn the red tape, because all of the things that happened here were predictable, and many of them were predicted, and were a product of the making the rules on what material you should use, where you should use that material, the construction quality, were all reduced. The key findings, the government was warned about this 25 years prior. So this is Labour as well as Conservative governments were warned. This coalition government was between the Conservative Party and the Lib Dem Party, Liberal Democratic Party. This is where you get the cozy relationship between the regulatory body, which was the building research establishment, which was privatized. Everyone knew this would happen, that they would then be manipulated by the materials manufacturers and by the building industry. Exactly what happened. And I remember us discussing it at the time. We said this is going to lead to corruption and influence over them. So this was a human-created disaster, created by greedy people, by incompetent people, by people who didn't give a damn, and by people who did not understand that the role they played should be joined up with the role that others play so that it was coherent, and they were passing the buck. Boeing Max, 2 crashes, killing nearly 350 people. And the inquiry into that demonstrated that it was the result of reduced regulation on building quality and a cozy relationship between the government and Boeing. And for that, they eventually had to pay out $19 billion for getting it wrong. Now, some of you have probably seen that the Boeing 737 MAX has had other problems in recent months, including where a section of the fuselage blew out on the way to Alaska and other things. We haven't got time to go into it. Here's the British rail network, okay? Now, until the early 1990s, this network was operated by one company, British Rail. Now, we all used to joke about British Rail, whether the trains were on time or whatever. Rail networks are very complex systems with many, many factors affecting whether or not they're on time. What happened was that the Conservatives, because of their faith in markets, said, right, we're going to privatize these systems. The only way you could privatize it was to divide it up into 20 different companies. And they sold those off. Many of those companies are foreign. I'm not being anti-foreign here. Many of those companies are state-owned companies from other countries. The French, the German, I think even the Spanish. Those state companies are making profits on the companies that they run in Britain. And when they don't make profits, they give up and the government lets them off and the government takes it over. So many of those, I think it's 4 or 5 companies now, were not profitable enough for the private owners. So they've given up and the rail networks have been handed back to the government. So in effect, 4 or 5 of these companies are now nationalized in the country. Now, this crazy system means that going from Brighton to London, there are 3 different trains you can get, and sometimes 3 different fares. And sometimes if you get on with the wrong ticket onto the train, they ask you to pay more money, especially watch out for the Gatwick Express from Gatwick. Okay, so this is an absolutely crazy system. When I did economics at school, we were taught that certain things were called natural monopolies. One was the railway system, another was water and sewage. These are natural monopolies because it is completely crazy to have the idea that they can be private enterprise. So if gas is another case I think there are probably 25 companies in Britain that will supply you gas for your cooking and heating. Okay, 25 companies. The pipe coming down the street is the same pipe. But you buy your gas from one of those 25 companies. If they have an increase in demand for gas, then that company will buy gas on the open market and they say, well, we are supplying this gas into the market. Completely mad. And this is the kind of why I think this idea of the market becomes a religion and not a practicality. 25 companies, 24 companies, 9 different private corporations. So the 3 lines that come to Brighton are all owned by the same corporation, but they market them, they have different brands, Southern Rail, Thameslink, and Gatwick Express. They're three different companies, but they are all owned by the same corporation. Water. This is the Financial Times, which is generally a friend to capitalism, showing that the water companies, which are privatized, are releasing sewage into the rivers and into the sea to the extent that surfers against sewage, who have been going now for 30 years, protest about these sewage discharges because it makes it unsafe for them to go in the sea. And a very famous TV presenter about 5 years ago called David Walliams, he did a sponsored swim from the beginning of the Thames to the mouth of the Thames in what was supposed to be clean water, and he got very ill from the diseases in the water. You know, from the Paris Olympics, they were worried whether the Seine was going to be clean enough. Well, these are deliberate discharges into the sea, and our one here, Southern Water, was fined that for discharges. And this is where we get the revolving door. Neoliberalism has also enabled people to switch between government and private enterprise in both directions, so that they can manipulate, if they're in government, they can manipulate government to have policies which favor the private sector. And then they come to, and this guy came from government to Southern Water, he knows how the government works, he's got his mates in government, and he can manipulate the system on behalf of the private owner of Southern Water, the revolving door. And Southern Water staff were convicted of preventing an investigation into their release of sewage into the sea. Fined for that. Convicted. Criminal conviction for doing that. So what happens at the University of Sussex? They appoint somebody from Southern Water as an advisor to the business school. Is that the kind of advice that the business school students should be getting? And then the 2008 collapse in the American financial markets, which, as you know, had knock-on effects around the world. So probably many of you are too young to remember it, but this was the most extraordinary event in which the bankers did not get arrested. There are 3 films about this, which are, I've only seen actually the one in the middle, The Big Short. They are recommended as, one of them is actually a documentary. The one on the left, Inside Job, is a documentary, not a feature film. And they will help to explain what happened in this crisis, in which $5 trillion in pension money, real estate value disappeared. 8 million people lost their jobs, 6 million people lost their homes. The core of the crisis was that banks had mortgaged houses and allowed people to buy houses on mortgages, which if they couldn't afford to repay, that meant they lost their home. Now, the banks then bundled these mortgages into corrupted packages and sold them on. So the people who were buying these mortgages were not interested in the people who were in the houses, and they didn't care if those people in the houses lost their homes. Millions of people out on the streets, literally from that, and this is just in the USA. So the next section is about why is the terminology of neoliberalism so confusing? What do I mean by this? I mean that liberalism is usually regarded as something which is good. To be liberal means that you're supposedly on the right side. All of it talks about freedom. All of these neoliberal ideas talk about freedom, but then people in our field talk about freedom and rights and so on. So why is it so confusing? Where does it come from, this terminology? Well, part of it is a deliberate misunderstanding or desire to misrepresent people like Adam Smith and his writings in The Wealth of Nations. So that's what I want to move on to now. Where does the terminology come from? John Locke, perhaps less famous than Adam Smith, look at his time, his period. Now, during his lifetime, many of you probably don't know, but there was a civil war in England, and there was actually a republic. I think it was for 3 years. We had a republic, no king or queen. Okay, that civil war was over how to control the aristocracy and the monarchy. And that was about how is there going to be a transition to a more democratic system. So in this sense, ideas of freedom were emerging, and John Locke was against the idea of absolute monarchy. I'm sure you all know this idea that many European monarchs and the Chinese emperor and the Japanese emperor all considered themselves to be ruling on earth on behalf of God. You all know that idea of the absolute monarch, and he was against that. And he also, this is what he's most known for, and I have not read Locke, I've only read about Locke, I haven't read his actual books, that what is the relationship between the people and the government? What should it be? And his idea was of how do we develop a social contract in human society? What should that relationship be between people and their government? Now, if you have a monarchy and an aristocracy, the idea is that they are in their place in a hierarchy, and at the bottom you have no rights. You're just at the very bottom of the hierarchy, in which the rule is done by these people at the top, and you have no right to challenge them. Well, of course, they were challenged by revolts, revolutions, and so on. But how do you replace that? What is it replaced with? And the idea of the Civil War in the middle of his life was to have a parliament which was more powerful than the monarchy. And that was how Britain should be run. So it's the beginnings of the framework within which capitalism can emerge, because capitalism was constrained by feudalism. The feudal lords were not interested in manufacturing, in businesses, in making things. They were interested in the profit they got from their serfs on the land. So this was about how do you have a different kind of economy and a different kind of politics. From around 1760, we have the emergence of thinkers who are doing what is called political economy. It wasn't called economics. I think political economy is much better than talking about either politics or economics, because you can never separate them. The idea that you can never separate politics from economics is ludicrous. And I think the original idea of these people who tried to analyze the economy was to see it as inherently political. So I think that's a much better idea. They were also called philosophers, and they were interested in how does wealth get created? Why are some places wealthier than others? What is the basis on which this can be understood? And Adam Smith wrote this, note the year, the American War of Independence, and the relationship between these ideas and ideas of the French Revolution, which followed a few years afterwards, about equality. Who was it said equality earlier on? This is coming out very powerfully in what you were saying. The idea of equality is important in this. Fraternity, going back to solidarity in the French Revolution, and liberty, that word liberty, liberty for whom? Liberal, neoliberal, all very, very complicated. So basically, the point here I would make is that as Europe emerged from feudalism, it was not clear what kind of social contract you would have, because the aristocrats were still trying to hold on to power. There were still royal families trying to hold on to power. And there were incipient entrepreneurs, traders, and merchants who wanted capitalism. And that group wanted freedom from the first group. They wanted to be left alone, laissez-faire, to be able to do what they wanted to make profit. And they did not want the interference by the aristocracy and the monarchs who wanted to control the whole thing for themselves. And so the emergence of this is about an idea of freedom from feudal control. But once capitalism is established, and once the idea of a parliament emerges, the idea that people have a democratic right to control the social contract on their basis, you have other people who become the workers who say, we want freedom from being exploited by capitalists. They want freedom from being exploited by the feudalists. Why should we create a system in which we are the ones who are exploited by the capitalists? And so in the 19th century, what emerges is another kind of fight for freedom, equality, and liberty, but not against the feudalists, but against the capitalists. So it was entirely possible at this juncture, which obviously went on quite a long period of time, it wasn't clean, it wasn't simple, for two different ideas of freedom to emerge, two different ideas of liberty to emerge, as different class groups considered what they thought was freedom and equality, and it was different from another group's idea of freedom and equality. And basically, that is the same as what is going on now between the Trumpists, who want freedom, liberty, okay? But they pretend that they want freedom and liberty for the workers and are basically spreading disinformation and lies, but many people are willing to buy that. So the idea of liberty and freedom, which comes up with neoliberalism in populist politics, is quite complicated. What's interesting is we actually look at what Adam Smith really said. And why is something so old still so controversial? In Britain, one of the most influential institutes who lobby government and are especially favourite to many Tories is called the Adam Smith Institute. And they write laws to try and influence. They have hundreds of meetings. They boast on their website how many hundreds of meetings they have to influence politicians in Britain. But there's a lot of bias, because if what you want from Adam Smith is the freedom to make profit, then you won't talk about the freedom from being exploited, or as a child sent up a chimney in the 19th century to clean, or to work in a factory. So their idea of liberty and freedom is, well, you will see. So this is his most famous quote. I'll leave you for a minute to read that. So basically what he's saying is that the pursuit of self-interest can produce the best impact for everyone. And that is the quote on which most right-wing people who support their version of liberalism seize on. They seize on this, the fact that there is no problem for an individual pursuing their own self-interest, because the outcome of that will be that everyone benefits. And that's a very powerful idea. What it also leads to is the idea that selfishness is acceptable. And also, if you don't succeed, it's your own fault for not being enough of an entrepreneur, which we will come back to. But he also said this. I've paraphrased it because of the old-fashioned language. So if you read the top one, this is what I paraphrased from. Now, I think Karl Marx could have written that. Yes? It's not the same as the previous one, but this one is not the one that the right wing quotes, because it isn't what they want. They don't want fairness or solidarity or anything like that. Obviously you'll see this on the slide. So it's very interesting also what Adam Smith argued for. It's too much to read out. Here's the Adam Smith Institute. Free markets create richer, free, happier world. See, they use the word belief, our belief. We can come back to that in discussion. There's a fatal flaw in their logic, okay, which we'll come back to. This is one of the original neoliberal organizations, the Mount Pelerin Society. Mount Pelerin's in, I think, in the United States. They're still active. This was a conference they held in Guatemala 3 years ago. They are crazy for neoliberalism. This is their statement of aims, which is still on their website, although it's from 1947. So it's a warning against those who want to support general positions in society. They boast that they've got 9 economics Nobel Prize winners, all white men. Then there's the Liberty Fund. I mean, America is awash with these foundations. We've got similar ones here in Britain. See, they call it the Liberty Fund, founded in 1960. The Cato Institute, some of you might have heard of. Cato Institute, you can read that. Beginning to get the picture. So they're all, oh, this one is particularly interesting because they are the sponsors of Project 25. Have you heard about this? Which is potentially Trump's blueprint for a second term. So watch out for this. I've got time. Then these words of freedom get bounded around in many, many places. And you'll know that the Austrian so-called Freedom Party has finished first in the election. So we want to ask freedom from what and to do what? Brexit was supposed to be about freedom. I have neighbours and friends who say, oh, we voted Brexit for freedom. And I think this is one of the key things which I hope to come back to the next time, is that humans seem to be divided, this is very, very simplistic, into 2 kinds of people. There are those people who think that fairness and equity should apply to everyone. and there are those who think that fairness and equity only applies to their own tribe, to their own group, the in-group, okay? And charity begins at home. And the idea that you only extend good things to other people if you can afford to, after you've looked after your own. Now, I don't think those two are necessarily contradictory, but they certainly seem to be the basis under which people think about the other. It's the basis under which racism arises, xenophobia, and so on. And we will come back to that. So there is this significant divide between those on the right and the left about how they consider freedom to be. And another is about how poverty is understood. I'll come back to that in a minute. Before we do that, how many people have to leave for a class at 2 o'clock? Some? No? Anyone? Already? You do? Right. So I'll have a quick pause now to enable anyone who needs to leave at 2 o'clock to ask anything you want. I know you're the only one who's put your hand up. If you have got something, I'm happy to take it now briefly if you have got to leave. It's all right? Okay. Anyone else? No? Any clarifications? Anything I said that wasn't quite understood that you would like? No? All right, I'll carry on then. Okay. This one is really, really important. How do you explain poverty? What is the explanation of poverty? Basically, is it structural? Is it part of the political economy? Is it something which is generated by the way in which the economy operates under political influence? Or is poverty because you're lazy? Or because you're ill and can't work? So this is kind of, we'll come back to it. Now, another lived experience of neoliberalism, extreme neoliberalism, was 2 years ago when Britain had a prime minister called Liz Truss. You might not remember her because she only lasted 49 days. With her finance minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, who she became prime minister, goodness knows how. It's like the Tory party has allowed the most inappropriate, ineffectual, and useless person to become leader, as has happened with Trump, with the Republicans. How can that happen? And she introduced a budget, they introduced a budget, which was almost pure neoliberal. She took down the top rate of tax for the richest people, which was already only 45%. She abolished that, abolished a number of other things which were very harmful to the economy. And the stock market crashed, the financial exchange crashed. And but the Daily Mail, which is probably Britain's most right-wing newspaper, said at last a true Tory budget. So there were people who were willing to support this in the media and so on. Well, you also might know that one newspaper said, right, okay, she's not going to last very long. We're going to put a lettuce. So this is a lettuce, you know, like you'd have for a salad. We're going to see which one lasts longest, and the lettuce lasted longer than the Prime Minister. So we all had a great deal of fun about that. Oh, and the influence here of somebody called Ayn Rand. Anyone heard of Ayn Rand? So Ayn Rand was from a family of Russians who escaped from the Soviet Union. So she had very good reason to be suspicious of the state, and poverty caused in that case by communism and so on. And she wrote some very influential novels, which these people still think are a good basis for designing an economy. And she's very influential in the United States amongst these right-wing organizations and so on. So how likely is it that neoliberalism can enable individual freedoms in the context of rising inequality and biased media? I like this quote. Does that ring a bell with people about what's happened? J.D. Vance got in on this act 2016 when he thought Trump was a useless human being. Now he's allied with Trump and his vice presidential candidate. He wrote this book about his supposed poor childhood in Appalachia. It turns out he actually had quite a good middle-class upbringing in Ohio, a different state entirely.
Eric, your mic's.
So his book promoted this theory, which, if you've got time to read, you'll see it in the slides after, argues that poverty is caused by the inadequacy of the individual, either to carry on taking drugs or being unwilling or unable to work or unhealthy, whatever. It's very much an individualistic idea. And he's now turned that around to argue that actually poverty can be structural. So this is quite interesting. And it aligns more with Trump's idea that the Rust Belt industries were destroyed by capitalism, offshoring their products to work in China and other countries, closing down American jobs and moving those jobs to other countries. So he seems to have bought into this kind of structuralist idea of what causes poverty around that. Okay, so some key figures I promise there will be time for questions and discussion. I'm rushing through this now because I've already, got a second part in later in the month. So I'm going to try to rush through this. Key factors: ideological preference for the private sector, which we've seen a lot of that already. Reduced state spending. Both of those are key parts of the structural adjustment programs that we'll look at next time in the so-called Global South. The small state, shrink the government, denationalize what was nationalized, privatize, corporatization, utilities, prisons privatized as well, and so on. Public-private partnerships, you've all heard of those, I'm sure. Outsourcing we've looked at. This one, league tables and competition between schools and universities. Neoliberalism gave rise to the idea that schools that were close to each other should compete for students. This is secondary school, even primary schools. And the government instituted a set of league tables, and they published these to show you where, in terms of their measure of quality, all the schools were. So, of course, parents were terrified if their nearest school was near the bottom of the league. And those who had money would literally move house to be near a school that had better conditions. So it promoted the housing market, but it didn't really promote improvement in education. The idea that every single school should be good went out. And so, of course, what happened with teachers, which teachers would want to go and work in a school that wasn't defined as good or excellent? Very few. So that had a negative effect on the distribution of teaching and so on. Universities. Do you know how universities in this country compete to maintain their income? Okay. One of the ways they do that is they have a league table as well. Sussex is first for development studies. Yeah. One of the ways it does it is what kind of degree you will get as an undergraduate. Now, some of you are from abroad would not understand that we have a very weird, old-fashioned degree grading system with a first, an upper second, a lower second, a third, and then a fail. Some of you are nodding like you've heard of this, okay? So you've got those five grades. Now, when I went to university, in the 17th century, when I went to university, in a group, let's say I did geography and there were 40 in that group, only one got a first. And maybe 5 or 6 got an upper second. So that's 6 people out of 40 who got the top grades. Okay. Now in Britain, the undergraduates who get a first or an upper second is 80%. 80%. Now, statistically, that's impossible. But it happens. Now, the reason it happens is because a student will see the league tables and will not choose a university which gets less than 80% first or 2-1. They will want to go to the one where they're likely to get the highest degree. And so this has led to what's called grade inflation, the idea that you mark higher and higher and higher, even when students don't deserve it, because you know that you will get terrible feedback from them, complaints about getting a low grade because they want to get that first or a 2-1 and so on. So universities are competing in a way which is very harmful to knowledge and education. And they're already closing down departments where they can't get students. So they're not really universities anymore. The Washington Consensus will come up next time because this was the supposed ideological alliance between the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization over what conditions would be allowed for economies to get loans. We're back to the structural adjustment policies. So the Washington Consensus, many people agree, was the kind of the basis for it. Now, one of the problems with how it's taken 40 years for neoliberalism to creep into basically every aspect of society. So each single change is not very noticeable. You think, oh, that's all right. We can live with that. But cumulatively, they have completely changed the society from what we could call welfare capitalism up until the 1970s to neoliberal capitalism, a very, very different flavor, which I will illustrate. Oh, just basic illustrations of this. These are very common in the so-called global south. You've probably heard of them, yes? And that's its definition. And they basically enable private companies to carry out aspects of what previously was government work. In Britain, the probation service has been privatized and is widely regarded as having failed. Prisons have been privatized. Anyway, not enough time to go on to that. Blair introduced private finance initiatives to get loans, investment from the private sector to build hospitals, for example, and many of them are very, very indebted, millions and millions of pounds of debt from hospitals that engaged in these processes. But they were a key part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And another key part of the SDGs is economic growth. So the thing that causes inequality, and I would argue causes poverty, is a key part of the UN SDGs. And I think this is a part of the problem. The SDGs were captured by the rich and powerful to define things in ways which were not going to be harmful to their interests. How do the banks and finance systems benefit from this? Sometimes they get caught. This bank, which I think is a Swiss bank, enabled the people to not pay tax to the French government, and they got fined $5 billion. That's quite a big fine. The revolving door, which I've talked about already, and the revolving door, especially related to the these are the so-called four big accountancy companies. It's wrong to call them accountancy companies now because they do many other things, and including aid projects, which we'll come back to. So they have been instrumental, along with banks like UBS, in enabling companies to reduce their tax payments. And this man, as an individual, was working with Price Waterhouse to reduce his tax bill, and he moved to Monaco because you can offshore your tax obligations by being a foreign resident in order to reduce his tax. PricewaterhouseCoopers, though, we can all trust them, can't we? this is the revolving door between the HMRC is the British Tax Authority. So he moved out of that and almost straight into a job with Deloitte. Now, we're all perhaps shocked or worried about this, but just over there in the business school, these would be the primary companies where you want to get a job. So I think there's an argument that anything that we try to do, which is good for the world at IDS, is outnumbered 1,000 times by what happens in business schools. Where do we fit into that pattern? And do we have any influence on how the business school behaves? Now, of course, they are doing some good things. They're trying to do green things and so on. But by and large, are the problems of the world that we are trying to resolve through development, are they or are they not caused by the behavior of corporations, banks, and so on? And are they not that 1,000 times more powerful than development aid? So that's for our project, if we do the project, and that's for the next time to go into that in more detail. Here's another one, Credit Suisse. We all thought the Swiss people were so nice. So again, I'm not going to go into you can look at these in the slides. Again, they got caught. Here's Oxfam calling out the billionaires for escaping paying tax and so on. I love a lot of what Oxfam does, and I think they're one of the most honest of the NGOs in terms of calling out what causes poverty and inequality. But really, so these are the big four. They give advice on reducing corporation tax to corporations and individuals. 10 years ago, the Prime Minister was forced to criticize them for this. But they got a huge contract from DFID, which is the aid ministry, as it then was, Department for International Development, on climate change. And they've been threatened with being broken up on the grounds of monopoly and conflict of interest because they no longer do accountancy, and we know that they're crooked in some of their accountancy. They've been held to account criminally, some of them, for their accountancy bad practice, but they now do consultancy and aid projects. So this is the Independent, which had this advert, I think in the same issue as when they were looking at the accountants facing heavy fines. This bank here, you recognize it? HSBC. They were caught about 6 years ago for money laundering for drug cartels in Latin America and were fined billions of dollars. But they're advertising. We're nice, we're lovely. And a senior politician in 2013 argued that these companies were actually deliberately trying to reduce tax which should benefit the people. And she said, companies which do this should not get lucrative government contracts. But it was too late, because in 2010, Price Waterhouse got a huge government contract to run projects on adaptation, mitigation of climate change, and research. And we got some of those those contracts for relatively small scale research projects. And they set it up through this CDKN, which you can have a look at their website. It got £70 million to do. This is the company which David Cameron criticised for taking money away from the government. And, well, you kind of, and I'm going to finish here. I think this is a stopping point. I haven't finished, but I do have a second chance because I want you to ask questions. I'm going to finish. NGOs are not off the hook here. NGOs are now corporatized. And some of the biggest are very large organizations. And I looked for data, and this is the best I could find. I had a friend who worked for Save the Children Fund. He retired probably about six years ago, and he told me what the salaries of the top 5 people in Save the Children Fund in Britain were, and I was shocked because this is more than 6 years ago. They were all over £150,000 a year. Now, I don't know what you think is reasonable, but I think that's a lot to be working for a charity that is supposedly helping poor children around the world. He said the Americans in Save the Children get even more. So I then looked it up. This is these data are 2 years old. Save the Children Fund USA, 6 senior staff get more than $400,000 a year. And they will argue, if we don't offer those kind of salaries, we won't get good people in the jobs. Well, I would say the people who want that kind of salary are not good people. I'm going to stop there and open it up for discussion. And at 2:30, those who would like to stay behind, we're going to meet with some students who did the course last year, from last year's cohort as well, who are coming. And we can see if anyone's interested in that as a project. So any questions? Oh, you need the mic.
Hello, my name is Cheboy, and I am unfortunately or fortunately from Kenya, which has been mentioned a lot in the presentation. So my country has been a victim of all the things that you have highlighted, and there's actually an ongoing demonstrations just today because there was a removal in the subsidy of higher education, and it led to an increase in 900% of the tuition fees. So now you've criticized a lot of the foreign investment in our respective countries and also the PPPs. So does this entirely mean that partnerships between governments should not happen with private companies? Where is the gray area? Are there some industry that should be completely out of the scope of private businesses as well? So where do we draw the line for that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Gary, you might need to turn the volume up. I couldn't hardly hear that. Could you all hear that? Yes, okay, right. Maybe need to turn the volume up. Where do you draw the line? Should they happen? Should public-private partnerships happen in you're implying in the global south, countries of the global south?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not against looking at the actual case on a case-by-case basis. So you wouldn't oppose it as an entire thing. But I think if you can examine who benefits and why they're wanting to be involved, then you might find there are reasons why it should not happen. So I'm inherently suspicious because the private sector, generally speaking, is not interested in people's well-being or welfare. So if you make the argument for a public-private partnership, basically the argument is that it will be a win-win, that the public will win out of that. Now, so that's one thing, is to examine the conditions under which it will exist. The other thing to do is to look historically, because they've been going quite some time. So we could do a survey of the last 20 years of what private-public partnerships have done and what they've achieved, and did they actually achieve their goals of well-being for the people who were supposed to benefit. So there are 2 lines of inquiry that we could follow. One would be specific to a new project, and the other would be historically. I would say that if the historical analysis of them, which I don't, somebody must have done it, I should perhaps look it up. I think my gut feeling is that many of them have not worked. So you said that's true. And what do we mean by have not worked? Have they brought the benefits to the people that they were supposed to bring the benefits to? So that would be the main criteria. So I think inherently, if the private sector is not involved in something, it's because they've already decided that they're not going to make any money in it, which is why I think this whole business about the private sector in development is fake. It's all based on the idea that somehow magically the private sector suddenly finds ways of making profits, which it never imagined before. But the private sector is very clever at finding new areas of projects. If anyone's looked at RED, any of you know about RED, reduced emissions from deforestation, degradation, and the carbon markets that go with those, they were very, very quick to find and realize that they could make money out of the carbon markets that were involved in RED projects. So there's no shortage of innovation in finding ways of making profit out of new things. So my fundamental question would be, if somebody is arguing that the private sector should be involved, first question is, why are they not there now? And I think the answer to that question is likely to be because they will get a subsidy. They will get payment from the state to do something. Well, in that case, is the argument that the benefit of having the private company involved outweighs the other negatives that come from making private profit? That would be how you would begin to evaluate it.
Yeah. I was wondering about like, I think a lot of people.
Can you hold it up to me?
Sorry. I think a lot of people here might want to go into consultancy, at least on my course, that's where a lot of people want to kind of go to, especially with sustainability. But
especially with the
like sustainability, like sustainable consultancy. But there's a lot of greenwashing and there's a lot of kind of grey area, like everyone will define sustainability so differently. What sort of kind of advice is there to kind of understand, rather than everyone working as independent sustainability companies, which seems to be like a growing trend of just working on your own, like what is there for like with an economic perspective where people can work together rather than all being individual consultants that work as a consultancy firm without falling into these like similar traps almost, or like similar company workings?
Well, the assumption there is that if they weren't all working individually and somehow came together to work collaboratively, that might be better. But that begs the question as to whether what they can do is useful anyway. Okay, I refuse to use the word sustainability. I think it's a con word. And anyone who uses it is using it to greenwash you now. And so I think that the idea of things being sustainable, let me put it this way. In 2019, an NGO, a research NGO in London, published a report, which I highly recommend. It's free to download, and it's called, God, I'm gonna have to send you a list of resources. Bankrolling extinction, bankrolling extinction. And they plotted all of the money lent by the 50 top banks in the world, which were mostly European and North American, how those 50 banks invested in things which damaged the environment, including climate change. And they found that the amount of money, just in one single year, and it's probably very similar most years, the amount of money that they invested in things that were messing up agriculture, water, destroying the environment, contributing to climate change, was $2.6 trillion. $2.6 trillion. Have you ever seen that amount of money available to organizations that claim that they're doing sustainability? No. I did a quick calculation. I haven't got that. I'll bring that slide next time. I think that the amount of money spent by governments on remediating biodiversity loss was around 10% of that, less than 10% of that. In other words, what I call, this I think is a very useful ratio, the damage to cure ratio. How much money is spent and invested to mess up the world environmentally, and how much money is put into remediating that through nature-based solutions and reforestation and so on. That ratio typically is hundreds to one. The amount of money spent on causing damage, which is what business as usual is with corporations, is hundreds of times more than the money we might get to put it right. And I think that damage to cure ratio should inform all of our thinking and behavior. There was one at the back there first.
Thank you. My question is, one of the arguments that are usually used by the neoliberals in support of the deregulation is actually too many regulations could create a situation of rent-seeking between the private sector and the government. What do you think about that arguments? I'm not necessarily in support of that, but I just want to hear your perspective on the practice of rent-seeking because too much of regulation.
Well, by rent-seeking, you mean that intermediaries are claiming fees in order to say that you have passed the regulatory hurdle. Is that what you mean in this case? And do you have particular examples in the construction industry or anything like that?
Maybe, for example, in the context of import quotas for livestock products. In Indonesia, for example, we have import quotas for livestock products. And
for livestock?
Yeah, for livestock products, for
Yes.
beef, those kind of
Yes.
things. And most of the time, these contracts are awarded by the government, right? And they are given a certain quotas to meet. But most of the time, the private sector are bribing the governments to, get more quotas or get more quotas than they are actually allocated for, or, reduce the quotas of the others, their other competitors, those kind of things. So what
does the government fear would happen if there were no quotas?
Protection towards the local products.
Domestic livestock products.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, I mean, that seems to be a classic example of corruption.
Yeah.
Where private individuals can get benefit by bribing government officials. I'm not sure that is particularly neoliberal. I think that's always happened. And I don't think it's anything specifically neoliberal about that. What neoliberals argue is that any regulation that restricts trade or, for example, is against, for example, in Britain, the argument would be about regulations make it difficult to build houses, either to buy land, to get permission to build on that land. So the regulations they're talking about, in that sense, they can't be corrupted. They are just barriers to the private enterprise that might want to do that development. But the rent seeking that you're describing has been going on for a very long time, and I would see it as not necessarily specific to neoliberalism.
That's the argument that is used by the neoliberals to deregulate, because too many regulations could create a situation of rent seeking. So, what do you think about that statement?
Well, it is certainly true that almost all people who define themselves as neoliberal will argue against restrictions on trade. So they would argue to reduce anything that restricts free trade, and they would be against quotas and those barriers to trade. But that's from their position as neoliberal ideologues. But the rent seeking that goes on happens under all forms of capitalism. I think the back one was next.
I want to get your appraisal on the structural adjustment program and to find out if you think there would have been a better alternative. Because, for example, my country, Cameroon, out of the structural adjustment program, was able to restructure the public sector. It benefited from the highly indebted poor country initiative program. But at the same time, it led to the privatizations of the electric company, which was run by the state, and also led to the liberalization of the forest sector, which we still have a big impact today. But I see it as it's like a mixed blessing. Do you think there would have been an alternative program different from the structural adjustment program?
Well, this topic on structural adjustments coming in the second lecture, where I focus more on development and the global south. So I'm going to pass it over to that time. Briefly, I think one of the problems with structural adjustment programs is that they were almost one size fits all. This is the ideology of what you must do in every given country. Now, I think it's perfectly possible that a bureaucratically inefficiently run electricity company, which is state-owned, could be reformed in other ways. But if it can be reformed by the private sector, what is impossible to achieve that reform by the public sector? So what we should be questioning is what is wrong with it? What are the barriers to its improvement? And how might that change in ways other than giving private profit? Okay, so certainly in the case of the British water companies, and was the case with the Bolivian privatization of water, handing over the company to the private sector, some of which are also owned by foreign countries, but foreign governments, was basically a license for them to hand money to their share owners. So, for example, they would sell off property and land for profit, which could then be used to give their shareholders their dividends, and at the same time put up the charges for water to the customers. So we need to examine what is the situation, what is the problem? And in your case, in a country like Cameroon, you might be able to find ways in which the private sector made electricity supply better. And you would examine that, we'll say, okay, what are the barriers? Let's do it under state ownership, if we can do that and make it better. So I think it depends. One of the problems with the SAPs is they had this almost exactly the same list of what every government had to do, never matter what the analysis is of the cause of the problem in each of those areas. But we'll come back to that next time. And I think this is an ideal topic if we are going to put something together for a collection of blogs or web things. That would be an excellent example.
Thank you for the passionate lecture, Professor. And I just have this doubt. So I have two assumptions that institutions are one of the strongest social structures that could bring people together to do something meaningful. And with development being increasingly becoming an industry, what do you think, how could we make use of the tool of institutions to, do better development, or or can you quote someone whom we could go back to refer to know how to build an ideal institution that doesn't end up being a neoliberal bandwagon?
How to build an ideal institution? Well, that would be a wonderful thing to do. I mean, I think every single institution is a reflection of the structures of power that make it want to come into being, if it's a new institution. So a new institution is generated by like-minded people who set up a food bank, like-minded people who set up a racist political party, an entrepreneur who gathers people around herself to say, right, we can make money from this and we can make the world greener, join my enterprise and we'll make the world a better place. So the scope for institutions to be created from the start is entirely a product of the people and their relationships with other people, where they say, either we want to change the world, and we would argue it's for the better, or we think we can do this better collectively, to your point, rather than individually. So I don't think we can make a prescription for the ideal institution because we don't have the power to define the conditions under which it comes into being. Does that make sense? You know, the conditions under which any institution comes into existence are not things over which other people have control. So I'm trying to see a positive way of taking that forward. But you see what I mean? We probably all got an idea of an institution that we think should exist, and we might want to help create it, an NGO or an enterprise, whatever. But we can only define it within the context of all the other institutions and people and actors who are around us. There's one here, Gary.
Thank you. Hi, first, thanks for the lecture. So you linked neoliberal lobbies and think tanks to the Trump campaign and neoliberal ideologies to Brexit. Yet I saw these two events as shifts away from neoliberalism. And in a book I read recently, this point was made. So I just wanted clarification on if the rise of Trump and if Brexit were shifts away from neoliberalism or not, just because these events did see an increase in the strength of the state and an increase in trade barriers, which are often counter to neoliberal ideas.
Yeah, I should perhaps clarify the fact that neoliberal organizations are favoring Trump does not mean that Trump is a classic neoliberal. I mean, as you know, he's in favor of tariffs, especially on China, even though he doesn't understand how a tariff works. If you've seen his speeches on this, it is, what's extraordinary about it is not only that he doesn't understand how tariffs work, but between each of his lectures, nobody tells him you don't understand how tariffs work and correct him. So Trump is far from a classic neoliberal, and I think that's partly because he is ignorant, unknowledgeable, and unread. I think it's well known he doesn't read anything, and he relies on people to tell him things who only tell him what he wants to hear. Brexit had, to some extent, a component of it which was anti-neoliberal in the sense of it being about greater autonomy for British business. But I think ideologically it was about emotional and non-rational. I'm quite happy that emotions are rational, so I'm not making that point. Quite happy that it was a response to what was perceived by many British voters as the lack of control over the politics of the country, which required an increased control over the economics of the country. And that to the extent that this reduced free trade, they were willing to buy into that in order that there would be greater political economy and autonomy, control over, for example, the legal system, over regulations, over who was and was not allowed to travel between countries. So I think that we're, in both cases of Trump and Britain and possibly other populist countries, there is a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. There is always the gut reaction to what are perceived as damaging imports to put up tariff barriers. But I don't think that undermines the fact that those who promote neoliberalism in the think tanks, all of those heritage foundations and all those, the Institute of Economic Affairs and so on, they just wait and bide their time, and they would probably favor a populist politician over Labour in Britain or the Democrats there, because they feel that what they really want is an unequal society in which they can get more money at the top, so that they don't want regulation of wealth. So that's an instant partial answer to it. Does it make some sense? Yep.
Hello. I only would like to know your perspective about the latest developments of the European Council regarding sustainability reporting. So it is now a law for...
Sorry, the sustainability reporting within...
No, the European Commission has now a law that requires large companies and all listed companies to report information about sustainability related impacts. And I would only like to know about your opinion on that, because to me it seems like the perfect environment for businesses such as the Big Four to profit from.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't study Europe very much. And so I can't really comment on that policy or that approach. It seems to me part of a general attempt by the European Commission to provide regulations that supposedly improve the environment. And so that possibly could be a good thing. But so I can't really comment on it because I don't know anything about it. Sorry. Are we done? Looks like it. Oh, one here, Gary.
Thank you. In your explanation, okay, sorry, my name is John Arok. In your explanation, if I got you clearly, neoliberalism is not corruption. So what is the relationship?
No, I didn't say that neoliberalism is not corruption. Corruption exists before and outside of neoliberalism. So it isn't necessary for there to be neoliberalism in order that there be corruption. And I think neoliberalism has allowed a lot of corruption, and possibly more corruption than there was. And certainly in some cases, I think in terms of how laws change, laws have been changed, for example, in Britain affecting financial institutions that in effect legalize corruption. And I think that's an important factor, because they can claim, well, what we're doing is legal. But if you looked at it from a moral perspective, either previously it was regarded as corruption, or it is not any longer something which society might approve. But no, I don't think, I think corruption has always existed. It exists in slightly different formats depending on who might catch you, how long you think you can get away with it before you get caught, and whether or not you have influence on getting caught. So I think corruption is sadly an aspect of how some humans behave. And I think it's independent of the flavor of capitalism that you're living under.
So I have this example. I come from South Sudan. So in 2016, my president went to China and signed a deal, a contract that is called Oil for Infrastructure, where the Chinese are supposed to construct roads. Then they take 10,000 barrels of oil per day. But since then, it has not gone anywhere. The roads are still underdeveloped. So is that neoliberalism or corruption?
Well, it's certainly corruption. You could say it's corruption, but I don't think it's neoliberal, because that would have been going on all the time under different forms of capitalism. So famously, a dam was constructed in Malaysia, a hydroelectric power dam, I think in the 1960s, using British aid. And the British aid money was dependent on them buying military goods from Britain. So it was a corrupt form of aid because it's what's called tide aid. And it was a way of making sure that jobs were kept going in Britain and that people would vote for the political party in government by those jobs not being scrapped and keeping support of the Malaysian government. So there's nothing unusual about it, and nor I don't think it is specifically neoliberal. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's one there.
Thanks for that. I just had a quick reflection on the presentation and the question earlier about what's happening in the EU when it comes to sustainability regulations. I feel like there is a slight shift now in the sense that these neoliberal organizations are not advocating for wholesale deregulation, but a very cherry-picking approach to what kind of regulations best serve their interest. And in the words of banks and investor forums, it's advocating for policies that are enabling. And the question then comes to enabling for what, enabling for whom, oftentimes is profit-seeking endeavors. And I think there's also, and within that dynamic of picking what kind of policies best benefit their interest, there's now a predominance of policies like sustainability disclosures that's on the premise of so long as you supply the market with enough information of what these companies are kind of operating, and so long as you disclose enough information, then the market will operate in the quote unquote rational way that it's intended to work and allocate financing decisions in the transition to net zero. And I wonder if you would also agree that there is that pivot towards not just wholesale, we don't want any policies, but it's kind of picking and choosing which policies then best serve our interest, disclosures and transparency-based policies over more behavioral action-based, like having a red line around fossil fuel subsidies or fossil fuel bans.
I don't have any comment or response to that because I don't know enough about the area that you're talking about. All I would say is a very generic response is that if a corporation can manage to avoid its responsibilities on the environment or social behavior, then they will. And so they will be looking to find any possible way they can evade, avoid, or change the responsibility that is being put on them by society. And they will try to get away with everything that they possibly can and still look good on the outside. They will still have a mission statement like PricewaterhouseCoopers that says we're all fluffy and cuddly, aren't we nice? But they will try to get away with everything they can. And history tells us that. The tobacco industry, the big fossil fuel companies, they're all trying to say we're cuddly and fluffy, but they try to get away literally with murder. I think we're done. Well, you've got amazing stamina. I've got even more amazing stamina. And I'd like to introduce to you Chandni, who is at the back there. She's from last year's cohort. And so last year we had what we called the Development Cafe, which was sort of about once a month we would meet in the cafe to talk about anything we wanted to relating to development. And we can still do that. Anyone that wants to do that, if you're interested, then send me an email and we'll set something up. But immediately we're going to see what interest is in that now. And Chandni, I don't think you know about the initiative, which I might have spoken about it before, but I've proposed an initiative here that people who are particularly interested in the way neoliberalism affected their own country, that we will get together to see if we can produce some kind of